call unto thee, O Lord, and send thou my life to guide us, for we are weak and afraid, and we lack knowledge. There is no one to hear your plea, no one to answer you, no one to ease your suffering. Lord, have mercy upon us.
Hey, welcome to the NY Patriot Show. Here we delve deep into the abyss, covering topics such as occultism, spirituality, secret societies, conspiracies, and the unknown. Join us in trying to put these pieces together and figuring all this shit out. The NY Patriot Show. Hey everyone, welcome back to another NY Patriot episode. Today we're going live, unfortunately, because of a strike on my show. We are going live on the Spiritual Gangsters YouTube, just to at least try to go live on YouTube and say fuck these guys. I'm still going to go on somehow. Today I have a guest that I've had multiple people asked to have back on. Since his episode came out, I've been told that through, I think, Instagram, Twitter, Discord when I had it, and people in Element now have both mentioned bringing on Esoteric Eddie again. So back by popular demand, I have Esoteric Eddie, and before that, I do have my amazing co-host, Teresa, here. So Teresa, just say what's up real quick.
Yeah, hey, thanks for having me back.
Yeah, not a problem. And now we will get back to the guest, actually. Esoteric Eddie, let everybody know, in case there's new people listening now that don't know who you are, just let everybody know, like, I guess, what you're about and where they can find your stuff.
All right. Well, hello, everybody, and thanks for having me back on. So I'm an author and a documenter. Just released a book last December titled The Lucifer Mystery Revealed. Working on a second one that should be out this September. I've got over 30 videos on my YouTube under Esoteric Eddie TV. I've been researching the occult, the conspiratorial, the esoteric for about 15 years now. My life has pretty much revolved around it, with many experiences and just coming across information ever since I was a kid. So this has really been my path my entire life, really. But yeah, it's a little bit of who I am amongst many other things that I do.
Yeah, I think the last time I had you on, coincidentally, we covered Lucifer, so now I'm thinking it might have had something to do with the book you put out then. So it's very interesting how now I'm having you back on to kind of cover a book that you'll be releasing soon. So it's funny how that works out.
Yeah.
So as far as I know, the new book you're putting out is along the lines of covering the Anunnaki, correct?
Yeah. So funny thing is, it's actually my first book. So I have two books basically. But the first book I ever wrote, I released back in 2018, and it was this book that I'm working on now, the Anunnaki Theorem. But when I wrote it back then, I was much more, eager, and my writing wasn't as fortified. So it was actually a failure, I would say, that book. So I kind of like put it out of print. And then years later, I released the Lucifer book, which is technically like my first professional piece of work. But I wanted to go back and do my first book justice. So I went through the manuscript and pretty much just scrapped the entire thing, just left a little bit of the bones, and then basically rewrote an entire new book. When I first wrote it, it was primarily about the Anunnaki, or at least I was trying to make it about the Anunnaki, because then I was still heavily into that topic. I was a fan of Zecharia Sitchin, still am, but I kind of just took everything he said as fact. But over the years, my studies have matured, and I've had to look at these things with a much more critical mind. So the book still centers around the Anunnaki, but it's more so an explorative, comparative theology piece, kind of just showing the progression of how the concept of God has formed over the years.
Yeah, and I have to say, I've even read some of Sitchin's work myself, too. I read Gods of War and Men. something about the whatever planet. I forgot the number, the 10th planet, 11th planet, whatever it says it is. I've read some of his stuff. Very interesting stuff for sure. And you did mention, would you say this was the first one you put out, and it kind of failed?
Yeah.
It might have failed for the readers, but at least now you know where you want to change it, and you know what I'm saying. So it may not have been necessarily a failure for you. You learned from it now.
Yeah.
So
I mean, it was a personal success, but just industry. I always say it was a personal success, but an industry failure.
You go.
And it's okay to fail, man. We got to go through those ups and downs, to fortify who you are as an artist and as a scholar and as a person.
True. When you first, and this is just a random question that I'm just wondering now, when you first put that out, did you feel like you censored yourself or held yourself back in anything that you wish you wouldn't have now?
No, actually, it was the opposite.
Oh, it was the opposite. Like maybe I should have censored myself.
Yeah. I went a little too personal because I was like super excited then. I was younger and I was just excited. This was my first book, so I felt the need to like kind of introduce myself. So I don't know. I kind of scrapped all the personal stuff because you don't need to really know about me. I just want to present the information.
Yeah, what's funny is that sometimes I feel like those two totally different things can be. Somebody could listen to your shit and be like, I really could care less about them personally. I just want to hear the facts. You know what I'm saying? Like Teresa, she has a completely different show, in my opinion, where you get more personal. And when she asked me to co-host, I was like, sure, because that's very different from my show. Even though we may even have some of the same guests, it's kind of very different. And I don't think we'll get a lot of the same people who will listen. It's kind of a different audience.
So just put it in a different place.
Yeah. So I can see how maybe, unfortunately, sometimes getting a little bit too personal about you could bore a reader who just wants that topic, So I guess it's you got to learn and just see what works. But I wanted to ask you. I mean, I'm assuming now, maybe since you mentioned Sitchin's name, but what was it, if you don't mind me asking, that even got you into the Anunnaki and interested in them? Like, where was that? Like, how did that ever come up? Like, how did you learn about them yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, man. I mean, ever since I was a small kid, like elementary, I was always like diving into deep things. I grew up. I was the youngest of four kids who grew up heavily influenced by like Pink Floyd, Bob Marley, Hendrix, all the good classic rock. So I always had like an anti-establishment attitude and viewpoint. So I was always an independent thinker. And then it was I got into cannabis and hip hop at a very early age too, which kind of helped spark that even more so. And then right around ninth grade, so like my first year of high school, I remember I've always been a reader too. I've always loved reading, but right around ninth grade, I was already reading and looking into certain documentaries, like in the conspiracy world. I'd already learned about the Illuminati and Freemasons and stuff like that. But one day I was at Barnes and Nobles and I would go to the New Age section, where all the cool trippy stuff is, and then I just saw, Sitchin's book there. It was just The 12th Planet, and the cover got me, and I kind of was just skimming through it, and the fact that it was nonfiction like tripped me out. Like, what? Like ancient aliens, it's nonfiction? Like this is crazy. So I just dove into it, and I just fell in love. I fell in love in particular because I grew up in a religious family, and I've always been intrigued by the Bible, and he just breaks it all down in such great detail, as to like how all ancient cultures and different major religions are all tied together through these beings and these stories. So for me particularly, that was just fascinating to see some expose the Bible in that way.
Nice. All right. Yeah, I think I didn't come across the Anunnaki until I probably heard of Maxwell, and then that led me to knowing who Zachariah Sitchin was.
Yeah, R.I.P.
Yeah, and I think what got me I guess not sucked in, but I think what caught me with even being interested in that is because there really is, like, in my opinion, a shit ton of stories that come from Sumerian texts that all have been told all over again in tons of different religions. I mean, there's even stuff when I think it comes to the Sumerians. I'm probably going to screw up the person's name. I don't know if it was like maybe Enkidu or whoever, but there was like someone that like is almost depicted as a robot. And or the way they describe it and kind of draw it. And I was like, yo, that's fucking wild that something that old was even talking about that. I might have the name wrong. You might know better, but I think there was somebody who was kind of described almost as like robotic.
I think Enki. Is that it? Yeah.
You might be referring to Enkidu in the Gilgamesh.
Yes, I was going to
tale.
say the Gilgamesh tales. Yeah. He had like there was like a robotic type, or could be perceived as that person with him.
Well,
right?
Gilgamesh was a king, and he was like a pretty arrogant king. He was just like taking people's wives and money and whatever. And so the people prayed to the gods and were like, "Yo, like send us somebody that can oppose him or be an equal to him." So the gods fashioned a being by the name of Enkidu. So he was kind of like this artificial, like half man, half beast thing. And then he sent him to Gilgamesh to like be his equal and like calm him down.
Yeah, and they end up like almost like some kind of fight, a boxing match, literally.
Yeah, they like fight for like days because they're like, they can't take each other down. So like after like fighting, they're just like, hey, well, let's just be friends. So they just end up being friends. And then Gilgamesh comes to his senses and he's like, man, I don't want to be a king anymore. Let's go find the gods and get eternal life. So they just like take off and become hippies and like go on this crazy adventure together.
It's like typical men who fight and then they're like, that's cool. High five.
Yeah, exactly. That's actually how I met my best friend back in the day. We fought through an arranged fight. And then after that, we're like, hey, man, let's be friends. It was the same thing.
That's awesome.
Wow. Yeah, that's funny how that works out. That's very true, yeah. Typical dudes. They let their ego down and then they're like, oh, you know what, maybe everything's okay, actually. We need to do this. Yeah. So what was it that really, just a little bit about the book, what was it that, like, I guess, I don't want to say inspired, but made you be like, you know what, this is like what I need to put out, or like this is what's really got me, like I need to write this. And to give an idea, maybe also after that, if you don't mind, somewhat of what you're kind of getting into in the book specifically. You know, it's a little teaser.
Sure. Yeah. So I grew up in a religious family. So like the Bible was always a part of my life, and that mindset was always a part of my life. And I grew up like kind of indoctrinated by it, more so like on the hell side of things. You know, I grew up just believing hell was real and the demons were real, the devil was real, you know, in the way that the church portrays it. So I played a huge part in like fucking up my mind as a kid, you know.
You know what's funny, and just real quick, and not to interrupt you, but I don't know if this worked for me, maybe will not work to happen to you, or maybe even you, Teresa. I was brought up like that, like for real. Oh, you do this, you're gonna go to hell. You do this, you're gonna go to hell. You do this, you're gonna go to hell. I was like, yo, this thing is like such a huge part of like life. I was actually interested. Well, what the fuck is actually hell then? And I feel like, unfortunately, because of that being a threat so much, it actually piqued my interest. Well, what is this thing that I'm going to unless I save myself now? So sometimes I even wonder if that kind of can pique someone's interest to being like, well, you know, to start looking at the dark stuff.
Yeah,
I think so. Yeah, I don't know if I maybe was as extreme as you, but yeah, it definitely like talking about it and making it like a real thing. Like it almost piques your interest in like studying. Well, what is it then?
And then that ends up leading me to all this other thoughts and ideas like we're getting into.
Yes.
Yeah, man. Yeah, it was embarrassing because like when I was a young kid, I used to be afraid of like hell and the Book of Revelation used to like freak me out when I was a kid. And I had this cousin, this older cousin, and she just was maniacal, and she would just love to freak me out and just start talking about the end of the. Start reading from the Book of Revelation and shit, and so it used to actually make me cry. Like I'd be like, "No, stop!" And then, but I don't know what happened. Like at some point, I just kind of like was like, you know what? Like I got to get over this fear, and I just like started looking into it. I used to read the Book of Revelation myself, and then I just got super passionate about it and thought it was all fascinating. And so I love anything that gets into the Bible into great detail. Like the Sumerian stuff and all that. Like I don't know. Like for me, knowledge is power. When you know things and you take it head on, the fear goes away. So that's always like a spiritual motivation for what I do is to break down the indoctrinations and the fears that are placed upon us by these archetypes and these institutions. But so what inspired me to write the book is I was just fascinated by all of this stuff, when I was young, and I used to go around and like present this stuff even in high school. Before the Ancient Alien TV show came out, like I was dropping all this knowledge on my friends, and I used to have this. It was insane. Like
Ancient Aliens Eddie, just like dropping bombs.
Yeah, like literally, like I would have friends who would like take me in like around school and be like, "Yo, you got to tell them that shit." Like they'd be like, "Kick your shit, Eddie," and I would just like go off and just start like presenting the information that I knew, and then so when the Ancient Alien TV show came out, it was funny. It was like I learned about all that stuff, and then like shortly after that show came out, and then I was just like, what the heck? Like, yo, this is what I've been telling you guys about. Like, it's on TV now. So it's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting to see like how mainstream it's become and how accepted it's become. But I still remember there was a time when people thought you were crazy for talking about that stuff.
Oh, for real. Oh,
so I've always been passionate about it, and so that it was just appropriate for that topic to be my first book, but now I'm having to rework the book, and I mean, it's been such a part of my life that I'm kind of honestly ready to leave that topic, but I don't want to leave it until I do it justice through this book that I'm going to release.
Nice.
That's cool. I'm gonna read it.
Yeah. And when you're thinking or hoping that should be out by when? You're saying September?
It's going to be out in September, yeah, mid-September.
Nice. Now, I don't know if this is anything you cover in the book, but do you happen to cover any stuff that like you maybe where you're pointing out stories that might have led into like the Bible or other religions?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so in the first chapter, I kind of just briefly go over the creation stories. And it's interesting that there's actually a lot of similarities in the Egyptian creation story, in the Sumerian creation story, and even the Zoroastrian story and the Bibles, the Old Testament story. They all start off with this idea of there being a darkness and even an imagery of watery darkness. They all talk about this etherical, watery darkness, and that through that watery darkness, the first being or consciousness or mind self-created or was self-created, and they all have this imagery also of like an egg or like an egg pod or something, and that being like broke through it, and then after that this being created the elements, and then after the elements it created the gods or then humans. All of those cultures, including the Old Testament, have that sort of imagery in that story, which is kind of weird and fascinating, and I don't know what to think about it, but they're all there, with those similarities. And then I kind of move through how that starts to progress into religions, into different ideas of God. But yeah, man, it's obvious and it's well known now that the Old Testament was definitely inspired by the Canaanite world and the Sumerian myths. Yeah. And the Bible even makes that clear, which I didn't know. Like I was fascinated when I was doing the research for this book. The Bible, for example, I think it's in Exodus 6, even states that the language of the Hebrews is that of Canaan. So the Bible makes it clear that the early Israelites, ancestors or cousins, if you will, were the Canaanites, which makes sense historically and geographically. So and what's even weirder is that if you don't know, the name of God, Yahweh, wasn't revealed until Moses came along, right? That's the whole story of Moses when he's in the Sinai desert with the wandering homies, his people. He meets God on the mountain. He says, well, what should I call you? And he says, call me Yahweh. But there's an interesting passage. He says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but I was not known to them as Yahweh. I was known to them as El Shaddai. So that's kind of strange. So the Bible has all these little hints and these little passages that tell you that God, whoever God is, used to be a part of the Canaanite pantheon.
That's interesting.
What?
Yeah, well, one, just because some of the names you mentioned, like I'm wondering, like how it's often. All right, it's often like I've often wondered, like I've thought before, because when you see like Crowley's his, I guess, his progression through magic. He was, kind of very much into like the Hebrew Kabbalah, then got into the Greek Kabbalah. But then, like, you'll even see on like some of his stuff, like he does have something with Ishtar. But I had often wondered, like, okay, what I'm getting at is like if he stayed around long enough, and I feel like the whole thing with like the Anunnaki and Sumerian stuff really hasn't gotten popular until like the last like maybe 20, 30 years. If he would have been around longer then, would you have seen more of maybe that stuff in his magical, initiations or stuff that he wrote about? But now I'm like wondering, like, did they already know about that and just weren't too big into it already? Because like that stuff, like some of those names you were mentioning, does go back to like stuff that is in the Hermetic Kabbalah. Maybe it wasn't actually not those names that are associated with those spheres. Maybe they're not as Hebrew as I thought they were. I don't know. That's very interesting. Because El Shaddai is even something that I would use. El Shaddai, El Kai, or something like that is even used in like the middle pillar ritual, where you're like saying a God name and thinking of a sphere across your body, and you just said it now. And Yahweh, I mean, that's real quick, something I wanted to ask you, since you're mentioning that now, I have seen this, and I was pretty interested by it, but never dug into it. Maybe you would understand more or know what I'm talking about. I think they're saying on the tablet that Moses had, technically, I think the writing, they say, can actually be decoded into like either you were saying like Canaan or some kind of like Sumerian, to where it's like, I think Enki's name might actually, or like something to do with, if you were to look at it differently or translate it differently, it would actually fit what you're getting into now. I don't know if you know anything about that. Something to do with where the writing on that tablet might not be what we thought it was.
Yeah, I have seen people present that before. I haven't looked into it myself yet, but I know what you're talking about. Apparently there is like some, you can translate Yahweh or something to Enki phonetically, or just with the lettering itself. But that would be crazy.
Yeah. No, it was something I came across, and I thought it was interesting. I was like, oh, maybe you'll know since we're talking about this now.
No. But like, as you were mentioning with Crowley, that's actually something that I got into in my Lucifer book, is that the occult is kind of alluded to an era. That's like a huge thing in like the New Age and the occult is, and they didn't really know about the Sumerians, because the Sumerian stuff we barely uncovered the tablets in the late 1800s. And then we didn't really start to get to dive into translations and understanding what the translations meant until like the 1900s, mid 1900s. And then it wasn't until, the 70s where Sitchin came out with the Anunnaki books and stuff. But like Blavatsky, for example, who preceded Crowley and who's also a huge name in the occult, she always talked about the Atlantean era, and she always had an intuition about, there being another race or another civilization that preceded all the other ones with knowledge, and she would call them the Chaldeans. And back in those days, that was a name for like the Babylonians, or even the Zoroastrians was the Chaldeans. So they had an intuition about it. They were correct in their thought, but they just didn't really know how to connect it to the Sumerians, because that was still new information then.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I just wonder, like, I've thought that before, like if this stuff would have gotten popular or known earlier in time, would they have like kind of started getting into that with their mythology and their magic and all that stuff?
I think they would have.
Yeah, for sure. I know you had mentioned stuff about the Old Testament. Is there any stories to you that you think stands out, like that's huge, that you're like, wow, this definitely came from Sumerian tablets and it's talking about the Anunnaki?
Yeah, I think the most prominent one was definitely like the flood story. Like that one's just just a smoking gun. There's a lot of other stories that have like allusions and certain similarities, but the flood story is like without a doubt a smoking gun. Like it's an obvious copy from the Sumerian story. And so the Sumerian one predates the Bible by a couple thousand years. We don't have an an intact Sumerian version, but the most intact version we have, I think, is the Akkadian version, which is the civilization that came directly after the Sumerians. So, of course, in the Bible, the story is one God, contemplating back and forth on what he's going to do with humanity. He decides to save one family through Noah and then kill the rest of us. But in the Sumerian story, it's not one God, it's two gods. And that's why you see that capricious nature or that hesitancy in the Bible. Because in the Sumerian story, it's two gods, and it's one God and Lil saying, let's kill them all. And then Enki saying, like, wait, hold up, like let's at least save one of them or something. And this, in the Bible, it's Noah and his family, which I think is a total of 8 people. And then in the Sumerian story, it's Ziusudra, or also known as Atrahasis. And he saves again in this little vessel, this little boat-like vessel. And he's also told to take some people with him.
I was hoping you'd actually bring that situation up, because I think that is actually a huge, I don't want to say copycat, but it's definitely, that's one of the ones that stick out in my mind. And, I think it's funny that I've said it myself, and I even think, like, that's been part of my basis on, like, how I think the New Testament might be very occult or just misunderstood, is that I think if you were to, and I'm not knocking God at all, if you were to look at the way he acts in the Old Testament, you might be like, damn, this dude's bipolar.
Yeah.
So I have, I know, like, some of the things people will say, if you do want to look at it as Enki and then Lil, then you could see how there's two totally different types of views on, oh, I love you, and let's give you a chance to, like, oh, you fucked up, you're dying now. You know what I'm saying? Like,
right.
Yeah.
And the, isn't there even
pretty
text, or, well, not text, like, cuneiform things, like, even showing, I think, like, where they think it was Enki having a conversation, I think technically, like, between a wall, kind of like, oh, well, I didn't tell him to his face, but he heard me between the wall telling him what was happening, or something like that, right?
Yeah, and like, and like wise God, and he makes a pact with the gods, like, all right, we're not going to tell any humans about this. And he's like, all right, I'm not going to tell any humans about this. But he goes to Atrahasis' hut, and he speaks to the wall. And he says, listen, wall. That's how it's literally read like that in the text. He says, listen, wall, I'm going to tell you this. I'm warning you, wall. And then he's like, what? Like, is that my God? He's like, I'm not talking to you. I'm talking to the wall. Like, so it's like a loophole. He's like, I didn't tell any humans. I told the wall.
That's so funny.
Got around it.
Maybe they were talking about the future, and, like, he posted on, like, the wall of, like, a Facebook page. That's what we're doing now. We're talking on walls.
Yeah.
Fuck.
That's funny.
Oh, man. Something maybe I should have actually had you go into at the beginning, but just real quick, I mean, I'm sure my listeners probably already have an idea of who the Anunnaki are, but do you want to maybe give, like, a little bit of kind of like an idea of, like, what their story is too, and, like, how they...
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so the Anunnaki are the gods of the Sumerian pantheon, and so the Sumerians are the oldest known civilization in modern history, going back, to about 5,000 BC. And they talk about these gods that they call the Anunnaki, the Anuna, the Dingur, and they're human-like beings who created us and also domesticated Earth to be suitable for themselves and for us. And what's interesting is the oldest piece of literature that we have, which belongs to this culture, going back about 5,000 years, is called the Kesh Temple Hymn. And it's a weird thing. And so this is the oldest piece of literature that we have. And it's about the Anunnaki. And it's talking about them building certain structures and praising each other and these structures. We don't know what the structures are, but that's what the text is. It's just them building this stuff and just saying, oh, this is the great house or temple. And then they're praising each other. So these beings, these people, these archetypes, go all the way back to the beginning of our modern history. And I say modern history because there are structures that are older than the Sumerian civilization, like Göbekli Tepe and stuff like that. And there's obviously the Atlantean theory, talking about their civilization that go, older than that. So these Anunnaki, these beings, they were the gods of our ancestors, and they were heavily worshipped, and we believed in them, greatly. But what's interesting, and when I did the research for this book, I found that Sumer was never actually a strong, unified kingdom. It was always a kingdom of warring city-states, and each city had its own patron Anunnaki or god. It was almost like gangs, like
gang territory. That's a really good way to explain it, though.
Exactly. And their entire history, when we look at it, it is just them warring with each other. It's like this city, tries to take over the kingdom, and then this city comes and wipes them out. And as they're doing that, they're justifying their wars through their gods. They're like, Enki's backing us up, Enlil's backing us up, And then the first kingdom to come and overtake the Sumerians was the Akkadians through Sargon of Akkad. So Sargon came through, and he took advantage of the fact that they were always chaotic and not unified, and just overtook the kingdom. And when he overtook the kingdom, he justified it through Inanna, I believe the great-granddaughter or the granddaughter of Anu, the head of the Anunnaki.
Now Inanna could also be switched to, then that could be Ishtar with somewhere else, right?
Yeah, so Inanna is Ishtar, and who is Astarte, who is Aphrodite, who is Venus.
Yeah, that's why I was saying I wonder if Crowley would have ever gotten into her, since he had something for Ishtar. That's what had made me think, like, if he would have been born later on, would he have been talking about her instead?
Yeah, I think that he would have been fascinated by her, because as the Akkadians overtook Sumer, Sargon, one of the first things Sargon did was institute his niece as the head priestess of the Temple of Ur, which was like the main capital of the Sumerian kingdom. And we still have some of her writings. She was known as Enheduanna. We still have some of her writings, and all her writings are like poems and praises to Inanna. And so just a quick breakdown, the Sumerian pantheon is headed by Anu, and then his wife, and then he has his two sons, Enki and Enlil, and then from there it just breaks down to all the smaller gods, granddaughters and grandsons of Anu. But Anu himself wasn't like this end-all be-all creator of everything. He was actually just an Anunnaki himself, who had to actually wrestle another Anunnaki for the throne. So he wasn't like the creator. He was just an anthropomorphic being who won the throne by wrestling, and wrestling naked. Actually, that's how they used to do it.
Of course.
There you go. Maybe that's what sparked the weird Egyptian shit.
Eddie, I had a question for you. So,
Sure.
I'm not as well versed in Sumerian mythology, but would you say that these stories are the same as the Greek pantheon and the Roman pantheon, or would you say that those pantheons are a continuation of this?
Yeah, I would say that the Greek stories are kind of renditions. They're kind of reimaginings of it. The Greeks are interesting because, to my understanding, the early versions of the myths, they would say that Zeus didn't come from heaven or the sky. They would say that Zeus actually traveled to Greece through the Mycenaean islands. Oh. That's how they would describe him. They said that he actually traveled there through the island chains, which is crazy because the Greeks got their alphabet and their early stories through the Mycenaeans. That's how they got there. And the Mycenaeans got their stories and their mythologies through the Hittites, and the Hittites were an offshoot of the Mesopotamian cultures. So in history and geographically, we have a clear indication that the Greeks got not only their culture, their alphabet, and their myths from the Hittites, but that all that stuff was directly influenced from the Sumerian stories as well.
It's interesting. Because I just feel like, the Watchers in the Bible would be equivalent to like the Anunnaki, and then their children with mortals would be the Nephilim, is my understanding. But you probably have a way more in-depth, nuanced understanding than me. So, and this in like symbolism too. I feel like it always goes back to like Canaanites and Phoenicians and tribe of Dan, and like all, like it always goes back to like the same thing. But then I feel like there's also an opposition force to that, which you could define as like good. And then Canaanites in the Bible at least would be bad. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But maybe that's not true. I don't know.
Yeah, it's just interesting how things kind of get flipped like throughout history. You know, like one deity might be good during one era of history, and then later on he just might be evil. You know, the Bible, it's like the Bible's like an interesting perspective on history. I mean, it's specifically a Jewish perspective on history. So everything's kind of like geared and centered around their point of view. And so certain people, certain characters like Babylon, for example, are deemed as evil. You know, but Babylon was a huge kingdom at one point, and they were a people at one point. And to them, Marduk, who was their patron god,
sorry,
it's all good. Things are getting flipped around.
Yeah,
right. There you go.
But to the Babylon, praise, but it's all of early human history was chaotic. It was all chaotic, and I get into this in my new book. And so monotheism and centralized power, a genius idea for later kingdoms, because everything was just chaotic and hard to control. So monotheism was instituted as a centralized power to kind of just like shut everything up and just like, let's all just huddle in and just worship this one God, and let's just stop warring and doing all this craziness. So that's kind of like how things started to slowly become how they are today, with centralized power, centralized government, centralized religion.
Interesting.
I had a question from a listener. Curious if Eddie has any information on Galu, or those of the underworld in Sumerian mythology. They were one of the 7 devils, or the offsprings of hell. Do you ever hear of anything of that or cover any?
Not familiar with that term or the Galu, but apologize. Not familiar with that one, but I'll look into it. Gonna write it down right now.
Sorry about that. Put you on the spot.
No, it's all good. I love it.
Now, this story also, and maybe you can give a little bit more detail about it. Weren't they also like, I know there's a whole thing with like mining gold and then going to the moon and then supposedly going to Mars. Could you, and then like the firmament, is there any way you can maybe kind of give a little bit more of a detailed story about like what all that was going on?
Yeah, so all of that comes from Sitchin. And so Sitchin's theory is that these beings, the Anunnaki, came here almost 500,000 years ago. And when they came here, they were mining for minerals and for gold and stuff like that, and resources. And that the reason they were doing that is because their home planet's atmosphere was dying. So they had the idea of breaking down gold into particles and suspending it in their atmosphere to shield them from space radiation. And that the planet they lived on circles our solar system every 3,600 years. And that's how they come here is that whenever it's close to our Earth, they just kind of like jump off from it with their rockets, come here, hang out for a couple hundred years. And then as their planet's leaving our solar system, they take off and go back. And as they were here doing all the work, now this part of the theory is rooted in the actual Sumerian text. As they were doing their work, they realized, or they felt like it was just too much. They didn't want gods. There was the higher gods and the lower gods. So the lower gods were doing all the backbreaking work. So they kind of mutinied and petitioned for some kind of help. Can we make a tool or some technology, or can we make a being that can do this for us? So the gods asked Enki, who was like the main scientist and wise thinker, what can we do? So Enki fashioned a new being, which was us, the Homo sapien, to be a surrogate worker, a helper amongst the gods. And this is reflected in the Sumerian stories. There's about 3 different occasions in the text that were available to us publicly that talk about our creation. And each time we're mentioned, or that story is mentioned, we're mentioned as being created through a process of a mixing of clay and their blood. So that's where Sitchin got the idea. We're like, well, maybe this is like a rudimentary way of telling us that it was a genetic engineering. And then when we were created, then that's when religion happened. We were given a certain amount of consciousness, but then Enki or other Anunnaki kind of instilled us with more consciousness, and then things kind of went haywire, and then they gave us the right to rule. And then after that, the priesthoods and the mystery schools were all formed and whatever. But that's all coming from Sitchin. That was his theory. There's actually nothing in the Sumerian text that reflect the whole gold part of it, and nothing that reflects that they were trying to save their dying planet. None of that is reflected in it. That was all him just kind of postulating as to what they were doing here to begin with.
Oh, okay, all right. That's
quite a theory.
Yeah.
Oh, it's interesting.
Yeah, well, that I because I was going to get into it a little bit later on, but like even with that story, I could see, I'm not discrediting the story itself, but I could see how, like, when you want to start adding all that stuff together in the firmament, I could see like almost like a story in the Kabbalah of like maybe these people are someone who's coming in or leaving from the abyss. It's hard to explain, but what's your idea with like the whole firmament thing too? Because comes from, is that another Sitchin thing, or is that actually in the texts? So now
the firmament. When you say the firmament, do you mean like the dome?
Yeah,
of the flat Earth?
Yes.
Okay. So of course that whole idea comes from the Old Testament. That's where we first came across it, and because the Bible mentions that God separated the waters, right, from the firmament, the waters above and the waters below. And again, that whole idea of like the waters is a strange thing that's mentioned in the Egyptian creation stories, in the Sumerian stories, and even the Zoroastrian stories. So this whole idea of the waters is just weird. But space itself is a trip. It's almost like it is like an matter. It's its own substance. But the idea of the firmament, and in the Bible it's called, I think in Hebrew, like the rakia or something, which means the hammered bracelet. And Sitchin does get into that a little bit. He never really talked about flat Earth or anything like that. But this idea of there being a hammered bracelet, or the firmament, actually what he said the firmament was, through his perspective, was the firmament is the asteroid belt. Mm-hmm. That's what he said. That was the separating of the waters above from the waters below, was the asteroid belt. Because interesting, the asteroid belt separates the outer planets from the inner planets. And that whole hammered bracelet, as it's translated into English, comes from the Sumerian story in the Enuma Elish. So the Enuma Elish is a really fascinating tale, which reads as if it's a war between the gods, but it's actually a tale about how our solar system was created, and the planets are personified as gods. And in that story, Earth didn't exist yet. All the other planets did, but Earth didn't exist. Earth was actually a part of a huger planet. So there used to be a bigger planet called Tiamat, and Marduk, or Planet X, or the planet that the Sumerians or the Anunnaki came from, enters the battle scene, enters the play, and comes and sets everybody straight, sets all the gods in their orders, or sets all the planets in their orbits. And he comes with his what's called the 4 winds, or his four buddies. And those 4 winds, or satellites, or moons, as Sitchin would say, actually cleaved Tiamat, who's the antagonizer in the story, cleaves her, cuts her in half, and one half of her becomes the asteroid belt, and then the other half of her, which is this messed up piece, closes up and becomes Earth over time. So this whole idea of the hammered bracelet which is what Sitchin calls the firmament. You know, he was also proficient in Hebrew. He grew up in a Hebrew school and all that stuff. So he says that the firmament is actually translated as this hammered bracelet, which is an idea that goes back to the Sumerian times. And that hammered bracelet or firmament is the asteroid belt, which is separating the outer planets from the inner planets. But that asteroid belt was actually the remnants of this old planet, which used to be Tiamat.
Interesting. Did you see?
It's really interesting.
Yeah. Did you see the movie Eternals that came out in 2021?
No,
probably not. I sometimes I watch those movies because I think they just have tons of like occult shit in it.
Yeah.
They do actually get into the idea, and I found it really interesting. I was like, holy shit, this goes back to like Sumerian stuff. The whole point in that movie was like these people either came here to where they can maybe try to help humanity, like kind of like grow spiritually, or start going in the right direction, and if not, Tiamat, that's inside the earth, was actually going to like come to life and destroy the earth, and like technically start like basically what I got out of it was really weird, but I think the best way to say it is that it was gonna like something was coming that was gonna start destroying planets, but in destroying it, it was gonna kind of take those souls and make them all as one. And the Eternals didn't agree with that either, thinking that we should be able to, I guess, become unified on our own and not be killed and have to be forced to unify in a weird sense like that. And I thought that was interesting how they used Tiamat, because I'm like, like now we're getting into like Sumerian conspiracy shit, and they're like acknowledging it and using it in the movie. And I was like, interesting.
Yeah, man. Yeah, I mean,
That's
it makes
wild.
for great. Yeah, it makes for great lore, And writers and movies, and they love to borrow from mythology. And Sitchin, I've heard him in interviews say that he was actually approached early on by like Steven Spielberg, to get ideas for some of his movies.
Oh wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, well, what you described before sounds like the War of the Gods and the Titans, kind of like the same kind of story.
Yeah, actually, it almost is. Like in the Enuma Elish, it's Tiamat and Apsu, they have children, which are the planets, and then Tiamat rebels against her kids and like wants to kill them, and then that's when like it's kind of the same story.
Very similar. And then like as a kid, I always wondered too. I'm like, are the stars just like gods? Like, is that their like prison in the sky? They're like chained to like one spot, the stars like in the firmament or whatever. I used to think that. I don't know. Maybe.
Yeah, could be. I mean, they're definitely weird.
Right.
Now, before you mentioned something about them pretty much being like, yo, we can't do this on our own. We need you to make something, help us out. Now, again, I guess what I want to ask is, I'm sure you've heard of this, but is this more of a Sitchin, I guess, thing? Because, I don't know how much he threw in there himself. Or is it more of a thing that from the text, from what I understood and what I remember from looking at when I was younger, they almost kind of got into like explaining how they made us to where it was like almost like in vitro, or it was like they almost said like it was they took this from this and that from that and tried to splice it together. Is that something that's actually from the cuneiform text, or is that another Sitchin idea? I mean, do you know what I'm getting at?
Yeah. No, that stuff is actually in the text.
That's what I thought. That's what I thought. That's what I was asking.
We've got about 3 different texts. One of them called The Creation of Humankind, another one called Enki and Ninmah, where that story is explicit. And in the Enuma Elish, it's also retold, where the gods are created, they're doing the work, and they don't want to do the work, so they ask Enki to make a surrogate. And each time in those stories, when he does that, he mixes their blood or a blood of one of them and clay. And that's also a precedent to the Old Testament version, where, again, in the Old Testament, when God makes us, he makes us out of clay. Mm-hmm. So.
Which that almost goes back to maybe it might be a golem. I could be wrong, but even going back into like, I guess mystic Hebrew stuff, you can take clay, and then I think you have to say, like, I don't know, all these letters or this name of God, supposedly that's impossible to say, and if you say it, your head will probably pop anyway. But I think if you, like, breathe that into the clay, it's supposed to actually come to life. So that's I see a combination.
Well, and isn't there something like if you break down our DNA, it makes like the letters like YHWH, something like that. People are like, see, God's like signature is like in our DNA, right?
Yeah, I've heard that too. That'd be pretty wild. I mean, I don't know if it's true or not, but our DNA is a fascinating thing too. And Sitchin talks about it a lot. You know, like for example, apparently the gene that controls our lifespan was tampered with, and scientists have come to that conclusion, which is kind of weird. So I guess the part of our gene that controls our life expectancy is called a telomere, and when we look at them overall through, like, I don't know, whatever, microscopes or whatever, they were specifically set to where they are. And what's weird is that the Bible, there's a point in the Bible where mankind lives hundreds of years, and then I forgot what happens, but there's a point in the Bible early on where God says, and then after that, mankind's life was shortened to 100 years.
Yeah, I remember reading that too. That's interesting. And then also too, like later in the Bible, it does talk about when, like Daniel's visions and in Revelation about mixing iron and clay, and that would be like an abomination. So that makes me think of, like, if you want to apply it to now, like things like graphene and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. It gets deep.
Right?
Do you think within those Sumerian texts, do you think, like, try to think of the best way to ask this. Not that it's, do you think there's stuff in there that isn't supposed to be taken on face value as well? Do you think there's, like, kind of like encoded or occult meaning within those texts as well?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is allegorical, and our ancestors were creative. You know, they're very creative, and they played around a lot with words and imagery. So I think a lot of it isn't meant to be taken for face value. For example, the Anu Elish story. Like, if you were to read it for face value, you would think it's just a war going on between gods, but it's actually a much deeper tale about how our solar system was created. And yeah, they would do a lot of interesting things, a lot of interesting poetic things. Like there's a tale called the Era Epic, which I talk about in the book. Sitchin used that to the Sodom and Gomorrah story, kind of showing that, oh, look, the Sodom and Gomorrah is in text. But in the Era Epic tale, for example, the god Era is like pacing back and forth, deciding whether or not he's going to bomb these cities of Marduk. And in that story, he talks to his 7 weapons. We don't know what the 7 weapons are, but he talks to his 7 weapons, and they talk back to him, kind of like he's just going crazy, like he's talking to his weapons, and they're talking back to him. So it's like, I mean, obviously the weapons aren't talking back to him. It's just showing how insane he is, and like how he's just going through this contemplation. And it's like if the Joker or something was like talking to his gun, and his gun is like talking back to him, like, yeah, do it,
Right. It's like at a Fight Club or something.
Yeah. So they were creative, they were very creative and like to play around a lot with imagery and poetry.
Now the reasoning also behind, I think, I guess Enki wanting to kind of end it all, not Enki and Lil. Yeah, we're getting screwed up. Whoever the bad guy, wasn't that also because like they were starting to supposedly mate with what they created as well? Is that part of that story?
Yeah, well, we don't find that in the Sumerian texts, at least not that I can find. And here's the thing, though, like since we found the tablets in the 1800s up until now, it's been estimated that we've uncovered maybe even up to 1 million tablets, but definitely 500,000. And only 10% of that has been publicly translated. And you can't even find like most of that online. You'd have to go to like certain universities and maybe ask permission to get a hold of some of this stuff. So online, you probably maybe 1% of the stuff that's been publicly translated. So there's a lot of stuff out there that's just still sitting on shelves or sitting on private collections or in the basement of universities and stuff like that. That's not, being shown to us.
Gotcha. All right. Yeah. No, I thought that that might have been a story among that. Because I did thought that somehow the Nephilim or the Elohim could have been translated over into Sumerian as well.
Yeah. So the whole Elohim stuff, right? So again, when we look at the Old Testament through the perspective that it's borrowing from the Sumerian stories, then that's when we can make that correlation. Because in Genesis 1:26, for example, when mankind is being created, we see the plural context. I mean, you can open up any English Bible right now, go to Genesis 1:26, and you'll see that it says, "And God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness." And scholars, they don't know what to think of that. There's all kinds of mental gymnastics that go around to explain that. But the reason why the plural context is there is because in the original Hebrew, it doesn't say God. It says, and the Elohim said, let us make man in our, so on and so forth. And Elohim, a lot of theologians and scholars have written essays on that word alone. And Elohim is an obvious plural word. It's a word that basically means the powerful ones or gods, because El means powerful, and then Him is like a plural word, like cherubim, or so on and so forth. So there's an obvious, telling of these beings, these powerful ones in Genesis, creating us in their image. So that's an obvious correlation to the Sumerian stories and mythos. And then in the Genesis 6 story is where we get the idea of the Nephilim. In Genesis 6, it talks about the sons of God mating with the daughters of men. And again, a lot of theologians and scholars have tried to, work around this whole story. And there was in early Christianity, there was a theory that came out to try to combat the whole God's mating with humankind thing. And it's known as the Seth theory. So there were some early Christian theologians that were like, no, these weren't angels. These were the sons of Seth mating with the daughters of Cain. So a lot of theologians and scholars have tried to do mental gymnastics to explain this away. But it's obvious in the Hebrew that these were angels, because the term that is used is the Benai Ha Elohim. So it was the sons of the Elohim, the sons of the angels, the sons of God. So these were divine beings that were mating with humankind that created the abominable offspring of the Nephilim. And when you go back and read the flood story, you'll find, interestingly, that God wasn't trying to flood the earth because we were being naughty or we weren't listening to him. He was actually trying to erase that offspring. Yeah. He was like, well, they're running around, they're procreating, like the only way to kill them was just to flood the earth.
Interesting.
That was the real reasoning behind the flood, was to kill off the Nephilim.
Oh. Supposedly, yeah. But then some people argue the Nephilim continued after. So it's like, was God unsuccessful in his plan? Some people say no, that was the end, right? So,
well, the Bible makes it clear. The Bible says that they were there in the days and the days after the flood.
Oh, where does it say that? I got to find it. It's okay. I can look for it later.
Real quick, but
it's like my favorite topic.
Yeah. No, the Bible says that very clear.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I think they still existed after, for sure. That's my own conclusion, but yeah, interesting.
Have you ever heard of the idea that the word Elohim actually is a male and female word in itself? How it's, I think part of it is male, but then it's like female plural or vice versa. I think when it comes to Hebrew, I think it's like that. I could be wrong.
To Hebrew?
Yeah, like even on the tree, on the tree of life, as you start getting down to the lower spheres before you hit the moon, you have there's God names for those spheres, along as other things. A God name, a God, the archetype of God at that point, archangels and other angels, and then whatever gods it kind of like would fit as well. I think the god name for those, one of the spheres is Elohim Sabaoth, and then another one is, I could be saying that wrong too, Elohim, I forgot the other one, but that would be for Netzach and Hod, or Venus and Mercury, right before you hit the moon. In my opinion, also in that tree, in that part of the tree, is where you start really getting into sexes and, I guess, categorizing here in the flesh. So I've wondered. I find it interesting that those two spheres, which are very close to now, when we start to actually get to sexuality in the flesh and the distinction between even male and female, though that god named Elohim is associated with both those spheres. So I could even see maybe in an occult aspect how that could maybe be used as showing male and female and something going on with them both.
Okay.
Yeah, but I'm just wondering, like, if you've ever heard of that or have any ideas or thoughts on the fact that the Elohim could be a male and female word together.
Well, something that was recently brought to my attention, which I thought was fascinating, was that the Star of David, right, which apparently some people believe is actually evil, and it's actually not the Star of David. It's actually the star of Remphan, who was a Nephilim. Of course, in the occult, or the esoteric realm, the Star of David is a sacred geometric symbol, which stands for like as above, so below, right? It's the male and female coming together. So I was talking to a fellow colleague, and he was explaining that the Star of David, or that symbol, represents the fallen angels and their story, because it's the male and female coming together. As above, which the angels were above, came below. So it's a encoding of the sin of the fallen angels, which I thought that was pretty wild.
That makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, well, see, that was like stuff that I was even thinking about before. Like, even when you start getting into like, because like now you had said that was Sitchin's stuff, and I do believe I know some people, probably even a lot of people that listen to my show, I'll be totally honest with you, might like take his stuff like half, assed. I do think that he does actually say a lot. I just think that like what I was saying before, you have to kind of understand where he's coming from. I do think he does add a lot, and even with that stuff with the gold and the moon, I think if you look at that in an occult aspect, it does actually kind of go along with the story in a sense. Like I was saying, if like you just mentioned the fallen angels, and if these were people that just, or beings or something that fell in through the abyss, I could see that starting to make sense now with like you have the moon, which is the first sphere as you're going up the middle pillar. Then you have gold, which is, a Tiferet. And that would be before, that's kind of like a connection between you and the higher self and kind of like channeling before you go forward. And then after that, you would technically, if you take that farther, cross the abyss and maybe go through the firmament. You know what I'm saying? So I could see how even the Elohim, or, all these things coming back and forth and then tossing in gold and the moon, I could see that being a story of creation, of things coming within and without, coming, in and out of this reality. As crazy as silly as that sounds, I could see that and match that with the Kabbalah. Now, I don't know if Sitchin did that on purpose to try to tell a deeper story. Maybe I'm just crazy and that's how I see it. But I do see how some of his stuff that I do think some people toss off as like silliness or incorrect is maybe a little bit more of deeper stuff that he's tossing in there that people just take face value and think, oh, this is retarded. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah, that's wild. Yeah, he could maybe have been sneaking in some occult, concepts in there.
Yeah, which I think still go along with the story, just might give it much more of a deeper aspect on another level. Instead of taking things as like an actual person, well, maybe this is an archetype of a bigger story. Just that.
Well, and a lot of the gods, like I'm not sure about the Sumerian ones, but like Kronos in the Greek pantheon, he has the Sith. So that could be like, a piercing of the veil kind of thing or whatever. A symbol of that, right?
Now I have Ron Diggity saying they were called the Raphaim or Raphaim. Yeah, post-flood.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well,
I
found that. I found that verse too. It's in Genesis 6:4. It says the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward.
Damn. Didn't fucking work.
Interesting. Well, and I've seen the Star of David or the Star of Remphan on Masonic temples also, like all the time. So I actually think I saw a pastor give a really good breakdown of it one time. I'll try to find it for you guys and maybe drop it in the element after. And he just, relates back to exactly what you said, Eddie, about the fallen angel story.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, man, it gets deep.
Yeah, that just made me think of just because I'm buzzed, my mind goes in like weird places. I'm just thinking of like The Secret in Him, but I can't remember exactly. For some reason, I think that they were trying to save. Weren't they worried about a great flood too, or something happening?
The Sumerians?
No, in this cartoon, The Secret in Him, but it involved rats, which if you spell that backwards is stars. So I don't know. I was just going on with like stars and a flood and all this shit. Yeah.
Oh, it's funny.
Dude.
Well, that always, like, I say this all the time because, I was raised like traditionally Catholic and Christian, whatever. And I always said, like, well, that to me, the fallen angels in whatever pantheon you want to say, that story is a key to understanding so much. And I feel like they withhold that story from us on purpose. Like, if you're just a regular, Sunday churchgoer, you don't hear that story ever. Like, you really have to go on your own and find that out. So I feel like that is purposely withheld from us.
Yeah. No, you're right. I get into that in the book actually too. And there's a reason for that. The early church wanted to do away with that story. And through the book of Enoch. So the book of Enoch, which is like an apocryphal text that used to be regarded as canon in even the first couple centuries BC up into the first couple centuries of the Common Era. I mean, it was heavily respected. It should have been in the Bible. Jesus paraphrases from the book of Enoch. Some of the apostles paraphrase from the book of Enoch. The book of Jude directly quotes and names Enoch. It was obvious that the book of Enoch was very important to early Christianity and the prophets. But the book of Enoch, obviously, prophetic text about the fallen angels. And I kind of chronicle how that story became unpopular with the church, and so much that they actually just wanted to denounce it altogether. Yeah. There are early theologians, like very famous theologians like Saint Jerome, who translated the Latin Bible, who denounce it and say, like, no, this stuff is crazy, because they didn't like that idea. They couldn't cope with the idea of angels being able to mate with us. I mean, that would just open up a whole mess, a whole flood, no pun intended, of theological destability. So they did away with that idea. And as the church progressed, the angels became more and more etherical and spiritual and less corporeal and physical. Yes. And that story used to be used to explain evil on our world. Evil used to be explained through that story. Everything got perverted and twisted when that occurred. And that used to be how it was explained in the church. But then after that story got denounced and demoted, then the Lucifer story became the basis for how sin was proliferated throughout the earth. It was that, Lucifer and his pride against God is where evil and sin really originates. So they did deliberately do away with that book, the book of Enoch, and that story, for that reason, because it's just psychedelic. It brings up a whole mess of things that destabilize the church and bring more truth and power to who we really are and what we're here to do.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I have a big problem with that for sure. So I think everyone should read Enoch.
Yeah.
I have I guess maybe a question, then maybe we'll wrap it up after this. I guess it'd be kind of like what your opinions of this would be. And I do find it, I don't think it's like a probably normal opinion that people would agree with or even think about. I'm even sure most of my fans would probably think this is a little too much. But I have often thought that the fact of being in the flesh, you're kind of screwed already. So I have often thought, as crazy as this sounds, could this technically in a way be hell and we ourselves in the flesh, actually the fallen angels? Now, or is it because of what's done in the past from these fallen angels? Are we already stuck in this situation because they're reproducing. You know what I'm saying? Like, I know that's a little deep, but I often think that, like, unfortunately, it doesn't sound the nicest or the prettiest way to paint this picture, but could we actually be the fallen angels? Because we're not an angel anymore. We're not in spirit. We're actually in flesh. Could that be part of us, I guess, could that have been part of us falling from grace?
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of truth to that, and a lot of scholars who have written about that. For example, Max Heindel, who started the Rosicrucian Fellowship. It's an offshoot of the Rosicrucian system. He wrote in his famous Rosicrucian Cosmo Conception or whatever that exact idea. Or no, he has an essay. Sorry, he has an essay about Lucifer and the fallen angels about that idea. So that is an idea within the occult circles. But yeah, man, it's a pretty heady thing. And one of my
it is.
But what one of my colleagues, the guy that I was talking to, who explained that whole, as above, so below, in the Star of David, he said something that also kind of shocked me and made a lot of sense. He says, religion and the Bible is not oppressing you. A lot of people say, oh, the Bible's oppressive, God's oppressive. But he said, the Bible's not oppressing you. God's not oppressing you. You don't have to read the Bible. You don't have to follow God. You have a will. But if you want to read the Bible, if you want to follow God, what it actually is a manuscript on how to become an eternal being. And in order to become an eternal being, unfortunately, you have to purge and purify yourself because of the perversion that has been done to us in the carnal flesh. So there's a lot of truth to that, man. If we want to get back to being souls, if we want to get back to being spirits and angels, we have to purge and purify ourselves in this realm.
Yeah, because, and just I'll make it real quick, and then, we can let Teresa go. I'm not trying to interrupt you, Teresa, if you want to say something. But, like, if you take, like, both stories in a sense, like, all right, one, they came here, they, like you're saying, whatever, if they were mining for the gold or whatever reason, and then they started making us. Now again, you said that they are not God. You said that themselves. They are not God. So they are not actually God. Maybe they're lesser gods, whatever, how you want to get into that. So they are not the all, they are not the creator, but there's something that came from the creator, I would assume. They weren't happy enough, I guess, with what they had. They had to start screwing whatever they had created. And then if you even go back to, and I know this may sound a little bit too conservative, and I'm not saying sex is bad. I mean, I enjoy it too, of course. But you take Adam and Eve. Now, of course, there is this story where she had, supposedly the apple and was told this and that, and now things changed. But if you still think about it, God gave them this is supposed to be, here, I made everything a perfect utopia for you. Still wasn't good enough, and you had to fucking make something else. What I created was still not good enough, and you had to find a way to make your own shit. I've often wondered, is that the whole fucking problem in itself? I don't know. Man. Like, why does this stuff only seem to come up as a problem once you're in the flesh? I don't know. Yeah.
Well, I mean, if we really take a look at it in a deep way, I mean, we all got here through sex. That's how humans are created. So it's like it's a powerful force. I mean, it's a force of creation.
Yeah.
So to pervert it and to sell it, it's actually pretty fucked up if you think about it.
But that was just sometimes, like, I often wonder. I'm like, as like I said, it doesn't sound like the nicest reality, but I've often just questioned, like, are we the fallen angels in a sense? So
I think we are, man.
So Teresa, I know you have a different outlook on things, so you may not agree, but I respect your opinion, and I'm sure the listeners do too. So.
I mean, are we the fallen angels? I'm going to say no. Maybe some of us descend from their bloodlines, perhaps, right? But I think it's like what your friend was saying, Eddie. I think it's all really like comes down to like a matter of will. And it's not just in the flesh. It's obviously was with these angelic or eternal beings also. They made a conscious decision to turn from God's will. That's why they got punished, if you want to follow the story, right? So it's the same for us here. If we want to follow God's will, we have to give up a lot of things. If we want to do what we want all the time, it's good now, but we don't get to enjoy the eternal kingdom, if you want to go by a Christian view. So it's like a paradox, right? It's constantly like that, a battle within ourselves. Like, do I do this now, instant gratification, or do I withhold, maybe be more mature about it and then enjoy it later when I'm, in the next realm, perhaps. It's just like, from a little kid, I've always thought life is just a test.
Yeah.
And
that we could probably all agree on.
Right, yeah, exactly. Some sort of test.
Yeah.
Whatever the end game is, we could debate, but
well, see, that's even another thing.
It's a matter of will.
Why I will even think that we might be in fallen angels or in hell already, because it's like, all right, you got to figure out why the fuck you put yourself here and fix that shit, and maybe you get to leave. I don't know, but like that's where I go. I'm not trying to discredit anything you said.
I mean, it's possible.
I'm totally fine with that.
It's possible.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think like there's always these two warring forces, either bloodlines or just energies or whatever. So it's like a move and a counter move on the part of like these fallen beings.
It's
God's
damn
will
free
and
will
their
that we
will.
have. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they have free will too, sure. And so do we. But it's a matter of what are you going to choose with your will? Right.
I think very well said. Well said.
Yeah.
And I think we'll probably just end it there. So thank you again, Eddie, for coming on. It was always it's always good to have you on, and I'm sure within another 4 to 6 weeks I'll have a reason to bring you on again. Always well spoken. You know what you're talking about, and I just like listening to you. For real. No homo. No. Yeah,
I appreciate it.
Yeah. And if you want, let everybody know where they could find your stuff again, and just plug that book again too as well.
For sure. Again, Instagram Esoteric Eddie, YouTube Esoteric Eddie TV. I got a book coming out in September. If you want to get my recent one, it's called The Lucifer Mystery Revealed on Amazon. Or you can get a signed copy through me. But I recommend getting the Amazon version. It's actually way better. It's cooler. I only have the first gen versions on hand, which aren't as cool looking. But that's where you can find me.
Awesome. Yeah. And I think, I don't know actually offhand if when I had you come on, you covered Lucifer. I don't know if that had a lot to do with what you had in your book. Now, if it does, I suggest people regardless, if this is the first time you're hearing him, go back in my older episodes. I had him on for Lucifer. The people in the chat were loving it. He was killing it. So obviously it did very well. Go check that out if you haven't already. And go check out his other stuff. His links are in the bottom. Teresa, would you like to plug your show as well?
Sure. Well, it's on this YouTube channel.
Yeah, that's true.
Spiritual Gangsters.
Yeah. Well, but it won't be when this drops on my end, at least. For
sure. Yeah, I co-hosted with you, and there we get like a little bit more personal. I'd love to have Eddie on sometime to talk about his own stuff. But you would get a little more personal, but then it always like relates back to the bigger picture of current events and whatnot. So yeah, come check it out.
Sounds good. Yeah, and your link tree is in the bottom as well as mine. So yeah, the link tree is in the bottom for my show, Lux Rising, and the Occult Rejects. Pretty much all of our important stuff is in there. We did announce Friday that we do have this new Element server up. We've had too many problems with Discord, with censorship and getting banned. Now we have this Element server set up. It's pretty badass looking. It's got tons and tons of stuff in there. So many different topics, other shows. And I do not think this thing will come down as easily as Discord at all. So that might be, that should be the new permanent home for all you people that were following us in Telegram and Discord. Definitely check out the show notes. That new Element server is in there. It's web-based as well, so if you're on your computer, you don't need to download a program. You can just go online, whatever. That's how I do it, because I'm like, oh, another app? Fuck no. You know what I'm saying? So it's web-based. It's really easy. There's really no excuse not to join if you're into following the show that much. So definitely check that out. A lot of hard work was put into it. And yeah, I'm done running my mouth and plugging my shit. Again, thank you very much, Esoteric Eddie, for coming on. It's always a pleasure, and I will definitely have you on again. And thank you very much, Teresa, for co-hosting with me. You helped keep the show going when I was speechless. So
it's my job.
Yes, thank you. Neither when I'm speechless or I took too many hits. I know. I got you. You got my back. So until the next one, and everybody, please thank you for joining in on the chat. I know this wasn't on my YouTube, so it wasn't as many people, but I had everybody who normally jumps in, all the hardcore followers and listeners. You were there. That's what up. Thank you again. And until the next one, everybody be well. Later.